Hey everybody, welcome to another Canine Cop Shop Talk. And I am super excited about today's episode because with me I have Dr. Caleb Lack, who is a clinical psychologist and author, and he is a professor at for the Department of Psychology at the University of Central Oklahoma. And Dr. Lack, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm happy to be on.
Good. So for those of you that don't know who Dr. Lack is, again, University of Central Oklahoma, but he has also written 6 books, over 60 scientific articles. He also somehow, on top of being a professor and writing all these scientific articles, he manages 2 blogs. And he also debuted, and how I met him was through the documentary A Reasons to Believe. You can catch that. I watched it on Amazon Prime. So you can catch that on Amazon Prime. And I'm sure it's on some other platforms too. I highly recommend watching that documentary. I was so inspired by the things that Dr. Lack said in that documentary that I reached out to him, and he was kind enough to grace us with his presence. So I'm very excited about this. I think we've been trying to coordinate this for almost a month now.
Yeah. We've got busy schedules, I think. So
we do.
I'm glad I can be on now.
Yeah. So if at the end of this interview, I'm going to point you in the right direction with a link as to where you can buy Dr. Lack's books that he's written. And there's one book in particular that I'm gonna hold off on. I'm gonna keep everybody hanging until the very end, because in the pre-interview, I asked Dr. Lack if he could recommend one book on this topic, which I'll get into in a moment. What book would you recommend? And you can purchase his books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and there's any place that really sells a book, right?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Okay, so the topic of discussion is belief. What we've noticed in the canine training world is that a lot of canine handlers, with the important job that you have, somebody teaches you a technique and you have certain tools in your toolbox. And if anybody says, well, there's a better tool, a lot of handlers get all pissed off. We see people, other handlers railroading other handlers or canine trainers on the internet. And in my opinion, and some of the other canine trainers that I've been talking to and interviewing over the last couple months, they agree with me. That's all got to go. We need to have more of an open mind. So the question is, why do we get to that place where we just close our ears and we don't want to hear it? And I wanted to bring in an expert in this field of belief. And so this is where Dr. Lack comes into play. And before we actually get into the nitty-gritty, Dr. Lack, would you mind giving us a little bit of a background in what made you get into clinical psychology and wanting to be a professor and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in a very rural area in Oklahoma. Farming and ranching was pretty much the only job that was around. And I went to college and then actually discovered psychology. My second semester, I guess, and I kind of haven't looked back since then. So I've been studying psychology and a professor for, about over 2 decades, I guess now, and got into clinical psychology specifically because I was working with people who had PTSD and other kinds of severe anxiety problems. So a lot of my early research was on PTSD in particular in children after natural disasters. And then I just kind of kept moving and expanding kind of expertise level to all the other anxiety problems. And one of the things about anxiety and about actually most mental health is that what really undergirds a lot of the problems people experience are the beliefs that they hold. And it's the beliefs that they hold either about themselves, about the world, or about the future. And so digging more into, how can we shift those beliefs? What are the methods that we use to shift those beliefs? Kind of dovetailed naturally with my interest in just kind of science in general and particularly scientific skepticism. So having a good critical thinking mind, and how can we make that not just for me, but how can we help the world become better critical thinkers? Mm-hmm. And so that really, those 2 areas, it turns out, dovetail nicely, because when I work with, let's say, somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder, I'm working on changing their beliefs that are leading to them to have all sorts of problems.
Mm-hmm.
And even if somebody doesn't have a mental health condition, it turns out their beliefs can get them in a lot of trouble.
That's true.
And yeah, as you kind of alluded to earlier, that can be either, I'm doing something that maybe is not the most effective, or maybe I'm buying something that isn't actually worth it, or I'm wasting time doing X or Y. And so for me, those two areas kind of naturally collided: scientific skepticism and clinical psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to my background, I'm able to be a little bit less of the angry skeptic,
Mm-hmm.
and more of the, okay, well, let's show you how to think about this a little more rationally. Let's show you how to think about how to not be defensive, and maybe let's even talk about changing those beliefs.
Wow. And, it's interesting because you brought up that you've studied PTSD a lot, and you've developed a lot of therapeutic ways of dealing with PTSD through changing the belief, because that's one of the things. I'm diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And that's one of the things that I'm learning as I go through therapy myself, is that sometimes we have those stuck points. I went through cognitive processing therapy, and we talked about those stuck points. And for me, it was the self-blame that, I developed this idea or this belief that I could have done something to change the outcome, and maybe my buddy wouldn't have died.
Yeah.
And so once again, though, that goes back to belief, and it created, all kinds of things like nightmares and other stressors. I started my self-worth begin to go down based on that one belief, which I found was really amazing.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
And it's incredible how little most people stop and think about their beliefs, right? And how those beliefs then impact not just what I think about myself, but how I interact with other people, who I interact with, what I think about, the world in general, my behaviors. I mean, the emotions I experience, those are really all rising from the different kinds of beliefs we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not to mention too, the physiological impact that negative beliefs have on the body. As I am studying psychology, I'll never forget I think it was my abnormal psychology class. My professor was talking about how the moment we have negative thoughts, the HPA axis in the brain is activated, and our brains produces cortisol. And unfortunately, even though cortisol is a necessity, it inhibits the action of the white blood cells. It increases the chances of infection. It promotes weight gain. It really has some damaging effects if prolonged day after day after day. And the only way to reduce it is to change the belief that's creating the negative thought, correct?
Yeah, you can't just, put a syringe in and draw out the extra cortisol or anything. You have to, stop what's activating that in the first place. And that HPA axis is really implicated in a lot of our anxiety disorders, PTSD, OCD, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, fears and phobias. And you see that sort of full body effect of, here's how I'm thinking about interpreting this particular stimuli causes the entire body to respond.
Right. Well, and I think for people to truly understand what we're talking about, I really feel like we kind of need to go back to the beginning. Could you talk to our viewers a little bit about how beliefs are formed? And I know, and on the pre-interview, I was telling Dr. Lack that, look, I'm just going to ask this question. You can run with it. And he's like, well, I teach a 16-week course. I could literally talk for 16 weeks. So I know that is a loaded question, but if you could just give our viewers, maybe however long you think it takes for them to understand, but if you could share a little bit with us about how our beliefs are formed and why they exist.
Yeah, I think probably the most important sort of baseline thing to realize is that most of us are not consciously choosing our beliefs, right? We're not sitting down one day and being like, I'll believe this and this and this. All right, thank you. It's not like a menu that we're ordering from. Instead, our beliefs happen because of our experiences. And that would be okay if we always interpreted the information around us in a logical, rational way, right? But we don't. So instead, what we tend to do is we form our beliefs based on the beliefs of those around us. If you just take religion as an example, the best predictor of your own religious faith is your geographic location.
Yeah.
Right? That's the single best predictor. And that's simply because you're more likely to have those folks around you that have that belief, right? So if my parents grow up in a particular church, I'm very likely to develop those beliefs, right? Just because of who I'm surrounded by, what information I'm exposed to. And in particular, whether or not I'm ever told it's okay to question that information, right? Or is instead, are authorities the only way that I'm supposed to learn, right? If someone tells me something, does that mean, okay, well, this is now gospel, right? This is written in stone, this is true and accurate, and I should never question that. And for a lot of us, particularly as we're growing up, in our early age, that very much is true. And there's some good reasons for that, right? Like in general, if someone survived longer than me, there's a good chance they may know a thing or two.
Sure.
But the problem is, oh, go ahead.
If I could interrupt real quick, it's almost like compounding beliefs. Like you just said, well, this person's older than I am, so you believe that they're trustworthy. And so it's really a belief that creates another belief that I must listen to this person. It must be true.
Yeah, and especially when it's reinforced in your environment, right? So if you're praised for obeying and listening to the authority figure and doing what they tell you to do all the time, then you start naturally developing that tendency to, this is an authority, I need to listen to them, this is how things work, I can't question it. Right. Or if you're punished for questioning, right. Or if you're punished for going against what the majority belief is in whatever realm we're talking about, politics, scientific matters, who you can and can't trust, it doesn't matter. But what happens is we start forming those beliefs based on who we're exposed to, what's happening around us. Right. And then the key aspect here is what maintains beliefs, I think. Because you're not doing a video blog to 2-year-olds, right? You're talking to adults, so they've already formed all these beliefs, and so understanding then what is it that's maintaining a belief, whether that belief is what I would call justified or not, meaning does it have good empirical or logical reasons for it or not. Lots of us are very good at maintaining those beliefs, even in the face of evidence against them. Mm-hmm. And that's I think the difficult part as you grow up and as you become an adult is we display what's called belief perseverance, which is once I hold a belief, it's really hard to shift it. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why, arguing with people on the internet doesn't work, right? Like I tell them they're wrong. And even if I'm right, they're just going to be like, yeah, whatever, you suck. I hate you. I'm going to be even more sure of my beliefs now, even if they're not well justified beliefs.
Well, and I think too on the documentary, you mentioned the 2 words psychological reactance, and I think is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. So psychological reactance is where if I'm just sort of directly confronted with evidence that goes against what it is that I believe, I do very quickly kind of put my shields up, right? Block it off, start finding problems in what you've told me. And then rather than weakening the belief, it actually strengthens it. So it's not just that I know this now, it's now I'm sure of it because you told me I was wrong. Right? Mm. Because how often do, most of us want to be told that we're wrong?
Yeah.
We don't like it, right? Because what does it mean? Well, it means, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I was wrong, I've wasted all this time and energy, money, etc. And so most of us are, trying to protect our own egos, not necessarily consciously, but that's what we do, right? So if someone tells us we're wrong, we automatically put those shields up, right? And we're like, no, don't you that information can't come in here, right? No, I'm not going to hear that nonsense. But if someone tells us something that is congruent with my belief, right? So it's the same thing as what I believe. What do? Come in here, right? Get in here, right there. I'm going to remember you. I'm going to, 2 years later, I'll remember that particular, point or argument or whatever it is, because it already fit with what I believe. And that's what we call the confirmation bias, which is our natural tendency to accept just unquestioningly information that confirms our beliefs, and then reject information that goes against our beliefs. And we all do that, all of us, very naturally, for whatever kind of belief we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Now, isn't it true, real quick, if you don't mind me jumping in, when you talk about confirmation bias, this has actually come up in the canine world quite a bit. I think when I was reading about your background, you talked about pseudoscience or like fake science. Like there's a lot of things that get skewed with certain so-called scientific research articles even. And I've tried to educate our viewers on like sample sizes. Like what I learned in psychology, the minimum sample size for a good qualified empirical research for statistical value purposes is 30 or more. So anything less than 30 really doesn't provide enough statistical evidence, but they can still publish that. So then people are going to grab that and say, see, I was right. Or they take a solid piece of research and they only pick out certain sentences that support their belief. And that really goes into that that's confirmation bias also, correct?
Yeah, very much. And that's what we would call cherry picking, right? So I'm presented with an entire, large menu of things, and I just pick those things that will confirm what it is I already believe, right? And then I'm going to ignore everything else, even if there's, let's say, 50 things that show that I'm wrong and 3 things that show that I'm right. Oh, yep. See, there's those things that show that I'm right. That's what I'm doing, right? And I'm going to take those, and again, I'm going to remember those. I'm going to pay attention to them, and then I'm going to ignore and discount the other things. And this is I think, a huge issue in a lot of fields is when you've got someone that's published research, okay, what's the quality of the research? Where has it been published? Who's doing reviews, right? As an example, and there's, I think one of my blogs has kind of the whole story. I get contacted all the time from what we would call predatory journals, which are these journals that just want you to pay a large amount of money and you can send in whatever, and they'll say it's peer reviewed, and then they'll publish it online in one of their journals, right? But all it is a scam. They want you to pay them $800 to publish this journal that's, headquartered out of an office in Russia or China, and they're publishing 200 journals a month, right? None of which actually have peer review. Right. So I got one of these for it was a journal on alternative medicine, right? And I thought, I'm going to have fun with this. Like, let's do something with this. So I sent them in, and I was like, yeah, I'd be happy to publish this, but I'm not going to pay your money. What can you do for me? And we literally went back and forth for 3 months, and they kept coming down, right? They were like $800. They're like $750, and I just kept being like, I've got a Kohl's coupon and some change. Like, can we give that to you? What's your office in China? And I'll send that over, right? And finally, they eventually were just like, please just publish, And so I published a satirical article in their scientific journal. And their peer reviewers, took 40 minutes to review it, immediately sent it back, said, this is fantastic, when I was literally making fun of what they were doing, right? Like that's complete satire. But there's all these sorts of journals out there like that now. And I'm sure there's a number of them out there in animal behavior, animal cognition, even perhaps dog training specifically. Where it turns out, I don't know if you guys know this or not, right? People can lie on the internet.
Oh, come on. You mean everything that you read on Google is not always true?
I know it's and even on social media, it turns out too, they can lie.
Unbelievable.
But if you don't have a really good, solid scientific background, you can't sift the sense from the nonsense, right? You can't determine is this a legitimate journal? Because the website looks pretty fancy, and it's got the American Journal of Animal Cognition or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, oh wow, this seems pretty legit, but it's not, right? And that's where I think we have to have what I call our bullshit detectors on at all times when we're online. And especially if I'm being given information that fits with what it is I already believe.
Yeah.
Because that's when we're especially most vulnerable to, oh, yep, I knew it, right? And not saying, hold on a second, let me look, let me see, is this a real person that even wrote this, right? Like, who are they funded by? What's their kind of end game here, or their goal? What are they trying to get you to do? Buy something from them, sign up for a training, whatever it happens to be, as opposed to here's someone who's doing research that's as unbiased as we can get.
Yeah.
That then gives us more information about how the world actually is or how it works.
Right. Right. Well, and I feel like too, that even if some research is just a load of crap, if it makes people feel good and they get rewarded by the people around them, like, they spit out some nonsense, but, oh, I read it on the internet, and people say, oh man, you're so smart. I mean, there's your reinforcer. And then soon all that bull crap just becomes a part of their memory. And then they're spreading that to all the people that they can influence. And again, going back to, and I really want to ask you this question from your professional point of view. It's the quality of trust, or the amount of trust that you have in another human being, that could do, like what we were talking about, like the social impact, like your social environment, like mom or dad. It's my parents. They love me. Why would they lie to me? It must be true. If you want to talk about religion. And so I feel like a lot of trainers or handlers, or anybody in the dog industry and many other industries, but because this is canine related, we'll talk about that. But I feel like a lot of people, because they have a false sense of trust for the person sending the message and providing the information, that they just adopt it without really investigating any further. Why should they, if they have trust in the person? Is this accurate? And can you kind of talk about some of maybe the deeper dynamics?
Yeah. So in my critical thinking class, we have a section on kind of why you can't trust your brain, right? Which is a lot of what we just talked about in terms of the confirmation bias and other ways that we process information. We also have a section called why you can't trust your world. And that talks about the social influence of things. So whether that's an authority figure, or whether that's everyone around me, even if they're not authority figures, who are all saying the same thing, right? And all, reinforcing each other for a particular kind of belief, or things like advertising. So it's extremely easy to come off, for example, as an expert today. Because I can have my website, I can have my YouTube channel, I can have a social media following, even if it's mostly bots, right? And all of a sudden it looks like all these people are paying attention to me and what I'm saying. And particularly if I am, not that I have this problem, but if I'm handsome and good looking, right? If I'm very charismatic, if I'm dynamic, then what you start to see is what we call a halo effect, where those qualities start bleeding over into people wanting to believe what it is that they're being told, right? Oh, I like this, right? This looks good. This person is handsome, they're suave, they're smooth, they're very pretty. Well, I'm going to believe them more. And we know that actually from a ton of research that's very much the case. And so that whole, especially if you are conditioned from an early age to believe authorities, right? And to believe them unquestioningly, which is the problem, right? Like believing an authority is not that bad or a problem if they have evidence to back it up, right? But if I'm believing them simply because they're an authority, that's where we start seeing these problems. And if I'm, again, raised from a young age within that mindset, if I'm perhaps working in a field where I've been sort of conditioned to accept authority and to not question authority, especially in very hierarchical fields, like, for example, military and law enforcement. Then a lot of times it makes us a little more prone to just, oh, they said this, they're an authority figure. I mean, why would they lie, right?
Right.
And I'm not saying that all the time authority figures lie and tell you misinformation by any means, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not even saying that authority figures sometimes tell you misinformation and they're lying. People can believe things very truly and deeply that are still inaccurate, right? And they can pass that information on. One example that I use in my class of that is, I ask my students if they've ever had to take a multiple choice test, right? And of course they have. And I said, okay, well, who in here's ever been told that, if you are taking a test and you put down an answer and then later you think, I don't know if that's right or not, that you should always stick with your first response? And they're all like, yeah, everyone's telling, yep, we've been told that. Who told you that? Teachers told us that, test companies told us that. When in fact, that's empirically untrue. Like, we know from carefully controlled studies, if you think that something is wrong later, it's probably because you've encountered new information that makes you think, oh, I should probably change that. And the people who go back and change those answers that they're now unsure of end up with higher grades. Now, were their teachers lying to them? Were they like, I'm going to flunk these little sons of guns, right? Like, no. Their teachers probably believed that. Why did they believe it? Because they've been told it probably by their teachers, right? And this stuff gets passed down where, unless you stop and question it and say, I'm sorry, what's the evidence to support that, right? Like, can you show me evidence to actually back that up? Then we just kind of fall into that natural human kind of thing of, oh, okay, authority told me, sounds good to me, I'll trust them.
Yep.
And, I'm sure that we have large amounts of that in the dog training world. Like I mentioned earlier, I grew up farming and ranching around all sorts of animals. And I've got a little hobby farm now with like goats and pigs and things. And I've seen that in so many different realms when it comes to different kinds of animals.
Really?
Horse training is a huge one, right? Where you'll have these gurus who say, this is the way that we train horses, or that's the way that we train horses. And then you go somewhere else and they're like, no, that's completely nonsense. We do this, we do that, or this is the way to, work cattle in this way or that way.
Right.
And the question is, okay, well, that's what you're doing, but is there any actual evidence to show that that is the best way? Like, have you compared these ways? Have you tested these ways in a non-biased, kind of experiment to see, are we getting what we actually want to get?
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's interesting about that is you mentioned that, when you talk about like professors teaching something and well, where did they learn that from? Well, they learned it from someone else and that person learned it from someone else. And I think that that's what a lot of canine trainers and handlers are failing to realize, is that science is always changing and evolving. We're always learning new stuff. So what we knew 100 years ago may have been changed the smarter we get with scientific research, and therefore methods and the way of dealing with issues is different. For example, we don't go in and take out pieces of brain out anymore to try to fix seizures. We don't drill holes in the head to let the demons escape for behavioral issues like we used to do back in the day, because we evolved and we learned. And you have to change as we discover more truths about people and horses and dogs and cats and so on and so forth. That's why people like you exist, is to help the lay people understand that, hey, well, 5 years ago, we didn't know what we know now. So yeah, how we used to deal with this maybe isn't really the best, but it was the best for the knowledge that we had.
Yeah.
When you agree?
Yeah. I mean, I often talk to my classes about, we talk about the difference between something like a science and a pseudoscience or a non-science. And one of the things about science is that, like you mentioned, it's always changing. Right? but it's always changing for a very specific reason.
Mm-hmm.
And that reason is that we now know we were wrong.
Yeah.
Not because someone else came and told us, but because we tested ourselves to fail, right? Like every time that I and my students put together an experiment, we're trying to disprove what it is we believe, right? And that's the key to science, is that I'm trying to prove myself wrong all the time, because it's super easy to find evidence for what it is that you already believe.
Sure.
And it's really easy to even set up a study to prove what you want to prove.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't tell you anything. It's only if we are doing experiments that show that, hey, I've tried to test myself to fail, right? I've tried to show I'm wrong, and I still got these results.
Mm-hmm.
It's only then that we can really start trusting those things.
Right.
But that means that we progress. You know, if I look at a physics textbook from 100 years ago and now, they're very different.
Yeah.
If I look at a psychology textbook from 100 years ago and now, they're very different, right?
Yeah.
And it's not because sometimes people are like, let's just change it so we can sell a new edition, right? It's like, no, we've learned more.
Yeah.
And when we contrast that with the non-scientific ways of thinking, what we see is that people get ideas and then they just keep those ideas.
Yeah.
They don't test themselves to fail. They don't try to make sure that I'm right by showing that they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just keep those ideas forever. Right. Yeah. And we see that in a lot of different realms, I think, whether it be about, you know, how to train a particular animal in a particular way for a certain job, whether it's how we should parent our children, whether it's, you know, what the best treatment is for X or Y, or, you know, who I can and can't trust. And that's, you know, those confirmation biases that we talked about earlier. That's really why we have to develop something like the scientific method. Because if we don't test ourselves to fail, then all we're doing is setting ourselves up to have false beliefs.
Sure. What does that do for you? And I'm sure you've proven your own self wrong with as much history as you have. But
Yeah.
What does that do for you? I mean, is it for you and the way your mindset is that a feel good thing for you? What is it like? What goes on in your head when you prove your own self wrong?
Yeah. So I think a good scientific mindset, and a good critical thinking mindset, is where you've got an open mind, kind of like you mentioned earlier, right? But not so open that your brain falls out, right? So I'm not just all the time completely open to everything. I'm open to being proven wrong, right? But you have to actually show me that I'm wrong. You can't just tell me I'm wrong.
Right.
And at the same time, as a good scientist and critical thinker, I've always got like this little voice in the back of my head saying, you know what, you could be wrong. Like, you think you know this, but you could be wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what drives me to examine my own beliefs and to do research and to be open to engaging with other people who believe things that are very different than I do, because I could be wrong. You're right. Right. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Because when I'm proven wrong, what that to me means is that what's happened is now I know a little bit more than I used to.
Yeah.
Right. Now I know better. Now I'm closer to understanding what, you know, the reality of the world is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't take it personally. Right. And that's where so many of us have a problem with that, is that, you know, if I'm wrong, well, that shows that I suck, right? And I'm stupid and I'm dumb. And
Right.
it's like, no, that shows that you're open to getting better, right? You're open to doing better. And whether that's, you know, as a police officer, or as a teacher, as a trainer, whatever it happens to be, that mindset of I could be wrong
Mm-hmm.
is invaluable, I think, because it leads us to start questioning what it is that we think we know,
Mm-hmm.
and then to develop those, what we would call a well-justified belief. So it's not just, I believe this, it's, well, here's why I believe it, and here's the evidence to support that belief. And that makes us, I think, better humans.
Sure. Well, and you know, for me, that was a huge learning lesson I started learning about training dogs when I was like 14 years old. I grew up with them in the home. I tried to train our own pet dogs, which were German Shepherds and things like that. So I've always been around strong dogs. And I took what the pet dog trainer as solid gold because I trusted that person. And
Right.
then I joined the Marine Corps. And when I got into, I became a sniper. And one of the top three things the enemy will do is send the dogs out. So they gave us a basic understanding of how dogs depend on their handler, which is why you don't shoot the dog first. If you can, shoot the handler first, because the dog's nothing without the
Right.
direction of the handler. And they started teaching us about that bond and how it's very similar to children. Like, you know, what we now know through some of the research by neuroscientist Dr. Greg Burns over at Emory, with the MRI imaging that he's done on dogs, you know, training them to lay calmly in an MRI machine with no sedation, no restraints. We know more about the reward system or the caudate nucleus, and they really do depend on us, which is great. So at a young age, I was very offended when people questioned me because I didn't have a mature enough or a creative enough mind to really evaluate. So I do feel like age kind of helps. You know, younger mind may want to defend ego a little bit more because that's their sense of worth in the family or in school or the social environment. But as you get older, I think if you really want to excel in anything that you do, you need to develop more of that critical mind to say, well, it's okay that I'm wrong. And I think for me, that's when I found my business, my video blog, and my ability to interview people has went through the roof with popularity, because I'm okay, same as you, I'm okay being proven wrong. And let me tell you, I've been proven wrong a lot. Talk to my wife, she will tell you, uh, 8 discussions out of 10, she finds a way to prove me wrong. And I'm like, dang it, you were right. And she goes, well, I'm not trying to be right. I'm just trying to bring logic into whatever the topic is. And I'm always talking about my wife, and she's always like, I hope people don't think that I'm really that way. And I'm like, no, I'll make sure I say something, because she doesn't want to create the belief.
Right. Right. Mhm. Yeah.
So
Well, I think one thing that you said was really important, and I would like your listeners to, I think, really hone in on it, which is being questioned. Right. If someone responds negatively to questioning in terms of, hey, can you tell me why this is right? Like, can you tell me why this is accurate and true, the information that you're telling me? If they respond negatively to that, right, that probably means that they can't, right?
ooh,
That they
that's
don't
good.
have that justified belief, right? So if let's say I'm arguing with somebody about politics, right? And I say, well, tell me why it is that you believe this or that. And they just get defensive and
Mhm.
say, well, that's just what I believe, you know. That's a shitty argument, right? Like, that's not useful. And all that does is that shows me that you don't know why you believe something, or that you
Wow.
don't have a good evidence to support your beliefs.
Mhm.
And like, if I'm in class and someone asks me a question and I don't know it, you know what my response is? I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because we don't have to know everything. But I tell you what, let's figure out how we can know that. How can we get that information? Right.
Yeah.
And if I make a statement in one of my classes or with one of my patients or when I'm consulting for these businesses all over the place, and they say, hold on, what do you mean? I don't believe that. I can say, okay, well, here's where I'm getting that from, right? Here's the empirical evidence to support this.
Mhm.
Here's why we know that this is, you know, as far as we can tell right now, the most accurate thing.
Yeah.
And if you get defensive and upset when people question you,
Mhm.
that's usually because you can't back your beliefs up.
And you get worked up because they're questioning like who you are, and then that's where you want to go into that fight mode of protecting your ego.
Exactly. Like, if someone shows me that I'm wrong, like, I don't take that as I'm a terrible person now, right? I take that as, oh, I was wrong. Now I know better. Okay, that makes me a better person.
Yeah.
But if your ego and yourself is so wrapped up in everyone, you know, being worshipful towards you and adoring of you,
Mhm.
then yeah, that's going to sting when you're wrong, right?
Yeah. Man, I have a question for you that's kind of off what it just hit me. And I don't even know if you'll have an answer for me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What I've noticed in training a lot of police officers is that dogs, like humans, they have off days. There's days where they're not as good as what they were the day before. And it seems like some officers almost live vicariously through their dog. So if their dog performs not so good, they get irritated and pissed off, and then, you know, of course they blame everything else. They go into was that self-serving biases, or
Mhm.
yeah, and they blame everything else but the fact that it's okay that your dog, I mean, it's like, why does the dog performance get translated into, well, this defines my performance as a police officer, and if my dog is not doing well, then I must not be doing well. I mean, why is there so much emotion, and why do they get so angry with a dog that we know is not 100% all the time?
Yeah. So I think you could draw a parallel between that and, let's say that you have a kid who's playing sports, right? And your kid doesn't have a good game, right? And the parents get all angry and upset, right? And they might blame the kid, they might blame someone else, but a lot of times they don't ever say, "Oh, is there anything I should have done differently?"
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a lot of times with trainers and handlers, you can probably see that same thing. Whether you're talking about canine handlers and the police, or you're talking about, you know, riders on horses, or whatever it is, because a lot of times what we're so concerned with is, don't make me look stupid,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if we think that, you know, that's a reflection upon us, right? So my dog didn't do very well today. You know what? We all have off days. I didn't do well the other day, right? But I'm not blaming my dog, right? There's other factors that could have impacted that.
Right.
And so I think it's important that when you're working in any sort of a team, whether you're talking about a canine human team, or you're talking about a sports team, or something at business, to understand that all of us have roles to play, and you know what? Not everybody's 100% all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if we then try and be punitive and punishing, instead of understanding, okay, well, what was the problem? And then how can we move forward to fix that so maybe it doesn't happen next time?
Sure.
Then we're going to have a very negative atmosphere, right? So if it was, okay, well, it turns out my dog didn't get enough rest, or I tried a new food and it upset their stomach and that threw them off, or, you know, whatever it happened to be, okay, well, I'll know to do this now differently in the future.
Yeah.
But if I'm in this mindset of like, no, I'm doing everything right, and I don't have that kind of critical self-examination
Mm-hmm.
of my own behavior and how that could then impact my animal, then you're likely to just keep having those kinds of problems.
Right.